On a sprawling plantation in Georgia, a father's twisted secret turned his own daughter into a prisoner, and what he did next left everyone in horror. The plantation stood like a monument to wealth and power, its sprawling fields bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. From a distance it seemed serene, almost inviting. Rows of crops stretched endlessly, whispering softly in the evening breeze, and the main house loomed at the center, its white columns gleaming like ivory sentinels, guarding a secret too dark to speak aloud. Visitors passing by could only see the facade, the polished floors, the grand halls lined with paintings and expensive furniture. But inside, the air was thick with fear and tension, heavy with whispers that never reached the outside world. The workers moved silently, heads bowed, their faces telling stories of suffering and submission that money could not hide. The owner of this plantation was a man of imposing stature, his eyes sharp and calculating, a predator cloaked in the elegance of aristocracy. To outsiders, he was a successful, even generous man, but within the walls of his estate, his cruelty was unmatched. He held absolute power over every life under his roof, and no one dared cross him. Whispers of his ruthlessness traveled in hushed tones through the quarters, shared between slaves only in moments of secrecy. There was an understanding among them. Survival meant silence, and silence meant life. And yet, within this atmosphere of constant dread, a darker, more perverse secret waited to be revealed. A secret that would shock anyone who heard of it. At the heart of this twisted household was his daughter. She was unlike the other girls of her age, both in appearance and demeanor. Her body had grown large and heavy over the years, a result of indulgence and neglect, a reflection of her father's distorted affection. He had pampered her in ways that made her world insulated from reality, yet the very thing meant to protect her also rendered her vulnerable. Her size drew attention in ways she neither understood nor could control, making her a target in a world already riddled with danger and cruelty. She wandered the halls with a mixture of innocence and ignorance, unaware of the darker desires that simmered just beneath the surface of those who watched her. It was on a particular evening, the sky painted in streaks of deep orange and violet, that the tension in the plantation reached an almost unbearable peak. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of smoke from the kitchen fires mingling with the earthy aroma of the fields. Inside the grand hall, the daughter sat idly on a chaise, her large hands nervously fidgeting with the folds of her silk gown. Her eyes wandered toward the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard, yet a creeping unease tugged at her chest. She could feel it, the unspoken tension that seemed to cling to every corner of the house, to every step echoing on the polished floors. The slaves moved about their duties in the rooms adjacent to the grand hall, their movements careful and deliberate. They had learned to read the subtle cues of the master's moods, to anticipate his whims before he voiced them. There was one among them, however, who would soon become a central figure in a story no one in the plantation would forget. He had long been aware of the daughter's presence, watching her with a mixture of fear, obligation, and curiosity. His position left him powerless in many ways, yet it also placed him in the eye of a storm he could neither ignore nor escape. He sensed that the day's events would bring the entire household to a precarious tipping point, and nothing would ever be the same. As evening fell, the master appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fading sunlight. The daughter's eyes met his, wide and uncertain, and for a brief moment the air seemed to quiver with anticipation. His expression was unreadable, a mask of composure that hid the dangerous intentions swirling beneath. He beckoned her forward with a subtle gesture, one she obeyed without question, for she had been conditioned to follow his commands, whether she understood them or not. The slaves watched silently from the shadows, their hearts pounding as the unthinkable began to take shape before their eyes. No words were exchanged at first. The master's gaze swept the room, and then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his attention to the slave who had been standing quietly in the corner. The tension was palpable, a silent drumbeat echoing in the hall. The daughter's breath hitched as she sensed the gravity of what was about to occur, though she could not articulate the fear coiling in her stomach. The slave's eyes widened, a mixture of horror and disbelief flashing across his face. He had seen cruelty before, yes, but never such an intimate, personal violation of innocence, and yet there was no hesitation. The master's command was absolute, and defiance was not an option. The world outside seemed to vanish as the master moved closer, his presence dominating the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every detail was magnified. The weight of his footsteps on the wooden floor, the cold glint in his eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw as he considered the next move. The daughter's body tensed, and she instinctively reached for something, anything, to anchor herself. But there was nothing. She was alone, exposed, and entirely at the mercy of a man whose intentions were as dark as the night that now approached. The slaves, though present, could do nothing. Their silence was a shield, but it offered no comfort. And then, without warning, the unthinkable began. The master's intentions, so long hidden behind the facade of wealth and refinement, were revealed in a way that would haunt those present for years to come. The daughter's world shattered in an instant, her innocence ripped away by the cruel and calculated actions of the man who was supposed to protect her. The slave, caught in the center of this horrific event, could only watch as the boundaries of morality and humanity were obliterated before his eyes. The room became a theater of tension and fear, each moment stretching into eternity, each heartbeat echoing in the silence that followed. Even as the initial shock settled, the air remained thick with dread. The plantation, for all its beauty and grandeur, had become a prison of unspeakable acts. The grand halls, once symbols of prosperity, now bore witness to a darkness that could never be erased. The daughter, her body and spirit violated in ways words could scarcely capture, became both a symbol and a warning, a living testament to the horrors that lay hidden beneath the surface of wealth and privilege. And the slave, forced into a row that no one should ever endure, carried the weight of what he had witnessed, a burden that would shape his life forever. Outside, the night grew deeper, the stars emerging slowly in the velvet sky. The plantation, bathed in moonlight, seemed almost serene once more, but the serenity was an illusion. Behind closed doors, secrets festered, wounds deepened, and the lives of everyone involved were irrevocably changed. There was no going back. The events of that evening had set into motion a chain of consequences that would ripple through the plantation, altering relationships, shifting power dynamics, and leaving scars visible and invisible. And though the world outside continued unaware, the darkness within the plantation walls was absolute, impenetrable, and terrifyingly real. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the fields, seemed to echo the memory of what had occurred. The daughter, the slave, and even the master were caught in a web of emotions, fear, shame, anger, helplessness, that would define the coming days. The very air seemed heavy with anticipation, as though the house itself were aware that its secrets could not remain buried forever. And yet, for all the horror, a strange, almost unbearable curiosity lingered. What would happen next? How far would cruelty go? And who, if anyone, could emerge unscathed from the shadows of such a night? The plantation's dark secret had been revealed, though only partially, and the tension that gripped Eve, wry heart inside, would not ease. Each person present knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning, that the true story of the night and the consequences it would bring was far from over. The evening passed with a heavy, suffocating silence, and as the moon rose higher, casting pale light over the fields and the house alike, one truth became chillingly clear. The walls of the plantation held more than wealth and power. They held darkness, a darkness that would reach into the lives of everyone it touched, leaving none untouched, none unscarred. The evening air inside the plantation house was heavy, suffocating, filled with an unspoken tension that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The daughter sat frozen in the grand hall, her large frame slouched against the chaise as though the weight of the world pressed down upon her. Her silk gown, once soft and elegant, now felt like a costume for a cruel performance she had never agreed to participate in. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with unshed tears, darted nervously from one shadow to the next, searching for a lifeline that would never come. Every flicker of movement, every distant footstep, made her flinch as if the walls themselves might betray her, whispering her shame into the cold night. She was alone, though she was surrounded by the silent witnesses who could neither help nor intervene, the slaves, her bodyguard, the servants, each one trapped in their own helpless terror. Her father's presence loomed like a storm of her small, fragile world. He approached her slowly, each step deliberate, a predator savoring the inevitable. His eyes were dark, calculating, and unreadable, yet there was an unmistakable glint of malice hidden behind the veneer of paternal concern. She could feel the coldness radiating from him, an invisible pressure that made her chest tighten and her heart pound like a drum in a silent forest. His voice, when it finally came, was deceptively calm, carrying with it the authority of a man who knew that resistance was not permitted. "You must understand, my dear," he said softly, almost soothingly, yet the words dripped with cruelty, "that some things in life are inevitable. There are roles we are born into, destinies we cannot escape." The daughter shivered at his words, sensing the twisted implication beneath them, unable to speak, unable to move. The slave, standing nearby, felt his own stomach churn, his hands trembling slightly. He had heard rumors of the master's cruelty, of punishments and humiliations, but never had he imagined something so intimate, so horrifying. He could see the fear etched into the daughter's expression, the subtle trembling of her lips, the way her fingers clutched at the folds of her gown, and he knew this would leave scars far deeper than the eye could see. The master's plan unfolded like a shadow stretching across the hall. He had made a decision, a cruel, calculated act that would humiliate his daughter in ways she could never have antic. I pated. The slaves, though powerless to intervene, watched with a mixture of horror and disbelief, knowing that this moment would define their lives in ways they could not yet comprehend. The daughter's body, already the target of cruel scrutiny because of her size, was now at the center of an unimaginable violation. She felt exposed, vulnerable, every inch of her existence weighed down by the authority and perversity of the man she had trusted most. As the evening wore on, the master's intentions became clearer, each action deliberate and unrelenting. The daughter's sense of dignity eroded with every passing second, replaced by a growing tide of shame and fear. The slave, whose role had been thrust upon him against his will, struggled to reconcile his own feelings of helplessness with the necessity of survival. He could not intervene, could not speak, and yet he could not look away. His eyes bore witness to the daughter's humiliation, and the weight of what he saw pressed down upon him like a physical force. Every sound, the shuffle of feet, the whisper of silk against polished wood, the subtle catch in the daughter's breath, echoed through the hall, amplifying the sense of dread that had settled like a living thing in the room. The daughter's humiliation was not immediate, nor was it sudden. It was a slow, methodical stripping away of her sense of self. She was made to perform tasks that were beneath her station, forced to bend to the will of those she had once considered her inferiors. The slave, though equally trapped, could see the physical and emotional toll exacted upon her. Her cheeks burned with shame, her eyes darted desperately, and every movement seemed calculated to draw attention to her vulnerability. She had been conditioned to obey, to please, yet now obedience itself became a mechanism of degradation. The master's gaze, cold and unyielding, followed her every motion, reinforcing the cruel hierarchy that defined their lives. It was not just the acts themselves that humiliated her, but the psychological weight they carried. Each command, each glance, each subtle inflection of the master's voice chipped away at her sense of self. She felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller, as if the grand hall around her had expanded to magnify her exposure. Her body, once a source of security and familiarity, now felt like a prison, a visible mark of her difference and her vulnerability. The slave, though unable to act, felt the daughter's shame as though it were his own. He had long understood the unspoken rules of survival in the plantation, yet witnessing this intimate degradation tested the limits of his endurance. Time seemed to stretch infinitely. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in sync with the daughter's trembling form. Each shadow seemed to mock her, amplifying the sense of exposure, the feeling that her dignity had been stripped away layer by layer. Her thoughts raced, a chaotic torrent of confusion, fear, and helplessness. She wanted to scream, to run, to flee from the room, from the house, from the oppressive world that had entrapped her, yet every instinct told her that such rebellion was impossible. The silence of the slaves, their bowed heads and still forms, reinforced her isolation. She was alone, even among those who silently observed her suffering. The master's cruelty was both physical and psychological, designed to break her spirit completely. He forced her to confront her own body in ways that were impossible to ignore, ways that magnified her insecurities and vulnerabilities. Every movement she made was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed, until she felt as though she existed solely for his amusement and control. The slave, witnessing this, felt an unbearable weight of moral conflict. He was trapped between obedience and conscience, survival and empathy, and the tension tore at him relentlessly. The daughter's humiliation became a mirror of his own helplessness, a reflection of the power imbalance that defined every moment of life on the plantation. And yet, amid the fear and degradation, there were flashes of humanity that shone through, fragile and fleeting. The daughter, though overwhelmed by shame, began to recognize small acts of defiance in herself, subtle shifts in posture, glimmers of resistance in her eyes. The slave, too, noticed these moments, and they ignited in him a conflicted hope, a dangerous, precarious hope that perhaps not all was lost. The master, however, was relentless, and any spark of defiance was met with immediate correction, reinforcing the brutal hierarchy that dominated their lives. The tension between oppression and resistance created a charged atmosphere, one that clung to every heart in the room and refused to release them. By the time the night deepened and the moon rose high over the plantation, the daughter's humiliation had reached its peak. Her body, her spirit, and her dignity had been tested in ways she could never have imagined. She sat trembling, her eyes glistening with tears that refused to fall, her hands clutching the edges of her gown as if it were the only anchor keeping her tethered to reality. The slave, though exhausted and overwhelmed by the weight of what he had witnessed, remained silent, a silent witness to the atrocities unfolding before him. Every breath in the room seemed laden with fear, every heartbeat a reminder of the power the master wielded and the vulnerability of those beneath him. The night stretched on, and though the immediate acts of humiliation concluded, the emotional and psychological impact remained. The daughter had been exposed, vulnerable in ways that no one could erase. The slave carried the burden of knowledge, a painful awareness of the cruelty that had been inflicted and the impossibility of intervening. And the master, satisfied for the moment, retreated into the shadows of his own dark mind, leaving the echoes of suffering to linger long after the immediate threat had passed. The plantation itself seemed to absorb the tension, the fear, the shame, becoming a living witness to the degradation that had taken place within its walls. Even as dawn approached, bringing with it the soft light of a new day, the emotional scars left by the night remained vivid and raw. The daughter, though outwardly composed, carried the memory of every humiliating detail, every fearful glance, every cruel instruction. The slave too bore the emotional weight, the knowledge that they had both survived, but at an incalculable cost to their sense of self and morality. And the plantation, seemingly serene once more in the morning light, held within its walls the invisible marks of shame, fear, and psychological torment that no wealth or beauty could ever erase. The air inside the plantation house had grown almost suffocating, thick with tension and the silent dread of everyone present. The daughter sat slumped against the chaise, her large frame heavy with exhaustion, fear, and humiliation. Her breaths shallow and quick, each one a trembling testament to the terror coursing through her veins. The candlelight flickered violently, casting long dancing shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to mock her, to stretch and warp her image into grotesque shapes as if reflecting the distortion of her world. The slave stood a few feet away, his jaw tight, hands clenched, his chest heaving from the emotional strain of witnessing. A scene that was unimaginable in its cruelty. Her father, the plantation master, advanced slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every second of the fear he had cultivated. The quiet in the room was heavy, broken only by the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath his polished boots. His eyes, dark and unyielding, roamed the room like a predator surveying prey, lingering over the daughter with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He spoke softly at first, almost soothingly, but the words dripped with menace, carrying the weight of authority and the promise of unthinkable acts. "You must understand, my dear," he said, each syllable deliberate. "Obedience is not optional. Tonight, you will learn the consequences of failing those who command you." The daughter's heart pounded so violently it seemed to echo through the room, a drumbeat of terror she could not control. She felt trapped in a nightmare that had no waking, no escape. Her large hands trembled as she clutched at her gown, twisting the silk into knots as though it could protect her, shield her from the horror that was about to unfold. The slave, witnessing the scene, felt a surge of helpless rage, a desire to act that clashed violently with the knowledge that any intervention would likely bring punishment or death. Yet he could not look away, his eyes forced to track the unfolding torment, his mind recoiling from the unthinkable acts that were about to take place. The master's first move was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it set the tone for what would become a relentless sequence of cruelty. He began by making the daughter perform tasks that humiliated her physically, exposing her size, her vulnerability, and the way her body moved in ways he intended to ridicule. She was made to bend, to stretch, to lift objects far beyond her capacity, every action designed to draw attention to her body, to force her to confront the shame she had never experienced in such concentrated form. Each movement was accompanied by the master's scrutinizing gaze, sharp and unrelenting, his eyes tracing the contours of her frame with a precision that left no room for dignity. The slave's stomach twisted as he watched. He had endured harsh punishments himself, witnessed cruelty inflicted on others, but the intimacy of this humiliation struck him differently. It was not just a display of power, it was a calculated assault on the daughter's spirit, a methodical breaking of her sense of self. She faltered repeatedly, her movements awkward, her breath catching in her throat as the master's quiet, cruel commentary reinforced her shame. Each word, each gesture was designed to dominate, to control, to remind her that she had no autonomy, no power, no escape. Then came the moments that crossed the line from humiliation into horror. The master began to impose physical challenges upon the daughter, forcing her into positions that were uncomfortable, unnatural, and painfully exposing. He made her stand, shift, and stretch in ways that highlighted her size, her perceived weaknesses, and her vulnerability. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her body trembling with the effort of compliance and the terror of what might come next. The slave's own body tensed, his hands itching to act, yet he remained rooted by fear and the knowledge that survival demanded silence. The master's cruelty escalated further, moving beyond the physical into the psychological. He forced the daughter to confront the gaze of the household, to be watched and evaluated in ways that stripped her of privacy and dignity. Servants, once mere shadows in the background, now became instruments of observation, their eyes silently recording every flinch, every sigh, every hesitant movement. The daughter felt as though the walls themselves had turned against her, the grandeur of the hall amplifying her exposure, the echoes of her movements bouncing back like accusations. Each heartbeat thundered in her ears, a painful reminder of the impossibility of escape, and then the acts became even more sinister. The master imposed tasks designed to humiliate the daughter in the presence of the slave, creating a cruel dynamic of forced participation. The slave, caught in this impossible position, was forced to witness and sometimes assist in ways that left him morally shattered. He could feel the weight of complicity pressing down upon him. his soul trembling under the knowledge that he could do nothing to prevent the abuse. The daughter, meanwhile, endured the dual terror of physical exposure and emotional degradation, her spirit battered, her dignity stripped, each moment leaving an indelible mark on her psyche. The master's methods were relentless. He exploited every insecurity, every vulnerability, every ounce of trust the daughter had ever placed in him. Her body, her size, her very presence became the focus of his cruelty. He made her carry out humiliating tasks that forced her to confront the perceived flaws of her own form, to see herself as the object of ridicule and disdain. The slave, witnessing this, felt a mix of horror, anger, and helplessness that clawed at his consciousness. He wanted to intervene, to shield her, to scream in defiance, yet he remained frozen. Trapped by fear, by circumstance, by the absolute dominance of the master. As the night wore on, the acts escalated, each more calculated, more cruel, more psychologically damaging than the last. The daughter was made to perform movements that left her aching, gasping, exposed, each one accompanied by the master's sharp commentary designed to reinforce her humiliation and break her spirit. Her eyes welled with tears that she could not release, her body trembling not only from the exertion, but from the suffocating weight of shame. The slave's hands itched to comfort her, to act, to disrupt the cruel choreography, but he remained trapped in the role the master had imposed upon him, witness, powerless, complicit by necessity. At one point, the master orchestrated a moment so cruel it would leave a permanent mark on both their memories. He forced the daughter to confront her own reflection in the grand mirror, making her see herself exactly as he intended, vulnerable, exposed, shamed, stripped of dignity. Her large frame, once a source of comfort and familiarity, became a weapon of degradation in his hands. Every movement she made was observed, every expression catalogued, every flinch recorded in the harsh light of the mirror and the unforgiving eyes of the household. The slave, though silent, felt each moment acutely, each act of cruelty stabbing into his own conscience like 1,000 needles. The master's control was complete. He dictated not only her movements but her thoughts, her expressions, the very essence of her being. The daughter, forced into submission, felt herself unraveling, piece by piece, the foundations of her identity shaken by the relentless onslaught of humiliation. She had never felt so small, so exposed, so entirely powerless. The slave, trapped in silent observation, felt the horror of complicity weigh on him, the crushing reality that in this house obedience and survival were inextricably linked, and the price of defiance was unimaginable. Even as the night deepened, the acts of cruelty continued, each one carefully calibrated to break the daughter's spirit, while maintaining an outward appearance of control and order. The master moved with precision, like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of fear and submission. Every instruction, every gaze, every subtle motion was designed to reinforce the hierarchy, to remind the daughter and the slave alike of the absolute power he wielded. The daughter's humiliation became a spectacle of silent terror, a performance in which she was both the victim and the unwilling participant. By the early hours of the morning, the daughter's body and mind were pushed to their limits. Her muscles ached from the physical exertion, her skin burned from the unrelenting scrutiny, her mind reeled from the psychological strain. Tears that had been held back now threatened to spill, and her chest heaved with the weight of fear, shame, and helplessness. The slave, though exhausted and morally shaken, remained steadfast, a silent witness to the horrors unfolding before him, carrying the knowledge of what he had seen and the burden of what he could not prevent. Finally, as dawn approached, the master paused, surveying the scene with cold satisfaction. The daughter, slumped and trembling, had endured the night's unthinkable acts, her spirit bruised, her dignity fractured, her innocence marred in ways that could never be erased. The slave, though alive, felt the emotional toll, the moral compromise, the impossibility of undoing the damage that had been inflicted. The plantation, for all its outward beauty and grandeur, had become a theatre of cruelty, its walls absorbing the echoes of humiliation, the silent cries of despair, and the indelible marks of psychological torment. even as the first light of morning crept across the horizon, casting pale illumination on the fields and the grand house, the events of the night lingered, like shadows that refused to be banished. The daughter's humiliation, the slave's helpless witness, and the master's absolute control had created a moment of horror that would define their lives forever. The plantation, once a symbol of prosperity, had revealed its true nature, a place where power corrupted absolutely, where cruelty could be intimate and intimate cruelty could be absolute, and where the human spirit could be tested in ways that defied comprehension. The first rays of dawn cut through the plantation windows, spilling pale light across. A grand hall, but the air remained heavy with the echoes of the previous night. The daughter sat motionless, her body slumped, yet her eyes, wide and alert, betrayed a new awareness. Fear still lingered, gnawing at her, but beneath it a spark of defiance had begun to flicker, fragile and tentative. She had endured humiliation, cruelty and violation, yet somehow a small part of her refused to be crushed. The slave, still standing a few paces away, noticed it immediately. The shift in her posture, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes no longer darted aimlessly but seemed to search, calculating, observing. For the first time, he sensed that something was about to change, though he had no idea how or when. The master entered the room again, his boots echoing ominously across the polished floors. At first, it seemed he intended to continue the torment, to assert once more the complete control he had so ruthlessly wielded the night before. But as he approached, he paused, a subtle frown crossing his face, a flicker of uncertainty in his otherwise imperious demeanor. Something was different. The daughter's quiet defiance, barely perceptible but unmistakable, had shifted the energy in the room. The air, once suffocatingly oppressive, now carried a tension that was unpredictable, dangerous even. The slave noticed it as well, a chill running down his spine as he realized that the balance of power, however delicate, was starting to wobble. The daughter, despite the humiliation and exhaustion etched into her body and mind, found her voice trembling but firm. She began, then stopped, gathering courage like a shield. I will not be made to be what you want me to be. The words, though small, resonated through the room like a spark in dry grass. The master's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker, something that hinted at both fury and fascination. No one had ever spoken to him in that tone. No one had ever dared defy him with words, and the audacity of it rattled the foundations of his control. The slave's heart pounded. He had witnessed countless abuses, endured countless horrors, yet this moment filled him with an unnameable hope. It was a dangerous hope, precarious and fragile, for defiance in the presence of the master was a risk of death. And yet, the daughter's quiet courage ignited something in him, a spark of determination that had been buried under fear and obedience for too long. He realized that survival did not have to mean complete submission, that perhaps there was a way to navigate the tyranny that had dominated their lives. The master's response was swift but calculated. His hand rose, a subtle gesture, not of immediate violence but of control, as if to remind both the daughter and the slave that he still held absolute power. Careful, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. You are treading a fine line, my dear. Yet there was something in his gaze that betrayed a newer Wareen. An understanding that the rules he had always relied upon, the absolute fear that had maintained his dominance, were shifting. The daughter's courage, small though it was, had introduced a variable he had never encountered, and that variable was dangerous to him. The daughter took another cautious step, steadying herself as she rose from the chaise. Her movements, though hesitant, carried an air of resolve. She refused to cower, refused to let her body, her very presence, be a tool for humiliation any longer. The master's eyes followed her, dark and calculating, yet the room seemed to hold its breath. The slaves in the corners remained silent, yet a subtle energy began to hum among them, a quiet recognition that change was in motion. The daughter's defiance, though terrifyingly small in the face of absolute power, had set something irreversible into motion. a challenge that the master could not ignore. The first act of unexpected resistance came not through words, but through action. The daughter reached toward a small object on a nearby table, a delicate trinket that had been placed there the night before, meant to amuse or distract her. She lifted it with careful precision, but rather than comply with the master's unspoken demands, she held it deliberately, a symbolic act of control. Her hands no longer trembled uncontrollably. They were steady, purposeful. The master's lips tightened into a thin line, a flicker of something almost like respect, or perhaps irritation, passing through his expression. The slave, watching this subtle shift, felt his own pulse quicken. There was a new tension in the air, a sense that the night's events had opened a door to possibilities previously unthinkable. Then, in a moment that would forever alter the dynamics within the plantation, the daughter spoke again. Her voice, firmer this time, carried through the hall with a resonance that was impossible to ignore. "I will not allow this to continue. Not tonight. Not ever." The words, though soft, were imbued with conviction. The master's eyes flicked to the slave, a silent acknowledgement that the household itself was witnessing a rebellion of sorts, a rebellion not of weapons or force, but of spirit. The slave, though filled with fear, felt a surge of courage, a recognition that survival might now include the possibility of resistance. The master, for all his cruelty, was not omniscient. The daughter's quiet defiance, coupled with the silent support of the slave, introduced a variable he had not anticipated. For the first time, he hesitated, his mind calculating, weighing risks, considering outcomes. The plantation, a place that had always operated under absolute hierarchy, now seemed to tremble under the weight of uncertainty. The daughter, though aware of the danger, pressed forward, her body moving with cautious determination, her eyes meeting those of the slave in a moment of silent understanding. They were, in that instant, allies in defiance, bound not by odds, but by the shared recognition that the master's control was not absolute. It was in this delicate balance that the first true act of rebellion took place. The daughter, with a combination of courage and desperation, executed a subtle but daring act that disrupted the master's plan entirely. Perhaps it was a refusal to comply with an order, a small gesture of independence, or a carefully timed action that defied expectation. Whatever the act, it sent a ripple through the room, a shockwave of tension that left everyone, master, daughter, and slave, holding their breath. The master's expression, a mixture of shock and fury, revealed the depth of his surprise. The daughter had crossed a boundary, challenged the unspoken rules of power, and in doing so had changed the trajectory of the night entirely. The slave, witnessing this, felt a mix of awe and terror. He had long endured the plantation's cruelty, but this was different. This was not compliance, not survival, it was resistance, and it was contagious. The subtle shift in energy was palpable. The air seemed to vibrate with the possibilities of rebellion, of defiance, of a challenge to the absolute control that had defined their lives for so long. The daughter, though trembling, stood taller, more focused, and more determined. The master, for all his calculation, had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit, had misjudged the depth of courage that could arise even in the most oppressed individuals. The tension escalated as the master attempted to regain control, his movements precise, his voice commanding, yet the daughter and the slave had begun to synchronize in silent opposition. Every step she took, every subtle action, was mirrored in awareness by the slave, creating a quiet resistance that the master could neither anticipate nor easily suppress. It was a dance of power and defiance, a high-stakes confrontation in which every gesture carried weight and every breath held consequence. The plantation, once a symbol of unyielding control, had become a stage for a battle of wills, a confrontation where courage and fear intertwined in a delicate, dangerous balance. As the morning sun climbed higher, the unexpected turn deepened. The daughter, emboldened by her small acts of resistance and the slave's quiet support, began to challenge the master more directly. Her words, once hesitant, became deliberate, carefully chosen, infused with the intensity of her determination. She questioned, she refused, she acted in ways that subtly undermined the authority that had so long dominated the household. Each challenge, each refusal was a calculated risk, and yet it carried a power that could not be denied. The master, confronted with this unforeseen defiance, found his control slipping even as he attempted to assert it with force and intimidation. The slave, now fully aware of his own role in the unfolding drama, realized that survival might no longer demand complete submission. He began to act in subtle, careful ways, supporting the daughter without overtly defying the master, finding the narrow lines between obedience and rebellion. The plantation itself, silent and imposing, seemed to pulse with the intensity of the moment, the walls absorbing the tension, the fear, and the sparks of courage that ignited within. The unthinkable acts of the night before had set the stage for this confrontation, and now the unexpected turn had shifted the balance, leaving everyone in the household on edge, unsure of what would come next. The daughter's defiance, though fragile and tentative, became a catalyst for change. The master, for all his cruelty and calculation, faced a reality he had never anticipated, that the human spirit, even in the most vulnerable, even under the most oppressive circumstances, could rise, could resist, could disrupt the absolute order he had relied upon. The slave, witnessing this transformation, felt a renewed sense of purpose, a dangerous yet exhilarating recognition that their fates were no longer entirely predetermined. The air in the plantation thickened with suspense, every moment heavy with the possibility of confrontation, revelation, and transformation. By mid-morning, the unexpected turn had reached its apex. The daughter, standing tall despite her exhaustion, her body still marked by the previous night's humiliation, met the master's gaze with an intensity that startled even him. The slave, positioned nearby, mirrored her resolve in silence, their unspoken alliance forming a subtle but undeniable force. The master, realizing that the old rules no longer applied, struggled to regain the absolute control that had once defined the household. And in that tense, fragile moment, the plantation itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as the unthinkable continued to unfold in ways that none could have anticipated. The morning light filtered softly through the plantation windows, illuminating the grand hall in pale, almost forgiving shades. But the brightness did nothing to ease the heaviness that hung in the air. The events of the night before had left an indelible mark on every soul present within those walls. The daughter sat in quiet exhaustion, her body sore, trembling, yet there was a subtle shift in her eyes, an awareness, a hardened resolve forged through trauma. She had survived what no one should have endured, but the cost was etched deeply into her flesh and her mind. The silk gown that had once felt oppressive now seemed like a fragile armor, unable to shield her from the memories that clung like shadows. Every detail, the cruel commands, the invasive gaze, the unrelenting scrutiny, played in her mind on a loop, leaving her breath shallow and her thoughts turbulent. The slave, too, bore the weight of the night's horrors. Though he had not been the target, he had been drawn unwillingly into the theater of cruelty, forced to watch, forced to comply with unspoken rules, and forced to confront his own helplessness. Each act he witnessed left a mark on his conscience, a wound no sunlight could heal. And yet, within the shared silence between the daughter and himself, there was a flicker of recognition, an understanding that they had endured together, that something in the night had shifted their fates irrevocably. Though fear still clung to them, a quiet sense of unity began to form, delicate yet unbreakable, as they realized that survival alone was no longer sufficient. They needed something more, something beyond mere endurance. The master, meanwhile, moved through the hall with the slow, deliberate precision of a man still trying to reclaim his sense of control, but the night's events had unsettled even him. His carefully constructed dominance, absolute and unquestioned for years, now felt precarious. There were moments when his usual command faltered, fleeting yet noticeable, the tilt of his head, the slight narrowing of his eyes, a faint pause before speaking. He had underestimated the human spirit, the resilience of those he considered beneath him, and in doing so, he had opened a chink in the armor of his authority. the daughter's quiet defiance coupled with the subtle solidarity of the slave had planted a seed of uncertainty in a man who had relied upon fear alone to command obedience. The plantation itself seemed to breathe with the tension of the aftermath. The once immaculate floors now bore subtle signs of the night's chaos, scuffed footprints, disturbed furniture, the faint scent of sweat and fear lingering in the air. Even the walls seemed to carry the weight of what had transpired, the echoes of despair and courage intertwining in ways that made the house itself feel alive, haunted by the actions of its inhabitants. Outside, the fields shimmered in the morning light, serene and untouched, a cruel contrast to the turmoil within. The plantation's grandeur, its wealth and polish, masked the deep scars etched into every corner, every object, every soul that had endured the previous night. The daughter rose slowly from her seat, each movement deliberate despite the ache in her muscles and the tremor in her limbs. She could feel the memory of humiliation lingering, a phantom weight pressing against her chest, but beneath it, a new awareness had taken root, a recognition of her own agency, fragile yet undeniable. She had been subjected to acts meant to break her, yet in surviving, in maintaining even the smallest spark of self, she had discovered a dangerous yet empowering truth, that fear could be confronted, that oppression could be navigated, and that her will, though battered, was not entirely extinguished. The slave approached cautiously, his own steps heavy with the remnants of fear and exhaustion. The silence between them was thick but laden with understanding. No words were necessary. The shared ordeal had created a bond forged in trauma, resilience, and unspoken solidarity. In that quiet space, a plan of survival began to take shape, not just to endure, but to reclaim some fragment of autonomy and dignity within the suffocating hierarchy of the plantation. The events of the night had altered the equilibrium. The master's control, though formidable, was no longer absolute. The master, sensing the shift, attempted to reassert his dominance, his voice cutting through the still air with sharp precision. "Remember, everything in this house is under my command." He reminded them, each word a threat and a test. But the daughter and the slave had internalized lessons the master could not anticipate. The daughter's defiance was subtle, strategic, and quiet, calculated to avoid immediate reprisal, yet enough to signal a refusal to be entirely controlled. The slave mirrored her caution, moving with an awareness born of fear yet tempered by a dawning courage. For the first time, the balance of power was no longer unchallenged, and though the master still held authority, it was now vulnerable to the resilience and ingenuity of those he sought to dominate. As the day progressed, the consequences of the night became increasingly apparent. The daughter moved with measured caution, her actions deliberate, testing boundaries and reclaiming small spaces of control in a household that had previously dictated every gesture. Each decision, each subtle act of independence, reinforced her emerging strength, slowly rebuilding a sense of self that had been fractured under the weight of humiliation. The slave, in turn, began to exercise his own agency, finding ways to act within the constraints imposed upon him, offering quiet support and strategic guidance to the daughter in ways that did not invite immediate retribution, but subtly shifted the dynamics in their favor. The psychological aftermath of the previous night lingered in every glance, every movement, every silence. The daughter's spirit, though battered, had begun to assert itself, a quiet force that reshaped the environment around her. The slave's perception of his own role had shifted as well. He recognized the possibility of action, of subtle resistance, and the moral imperative to support the daughter without triggering outright punishment. Together, they navigated the fraught landscape of the plantation with cautious intelligence, aware that any misstep could provoke retaliation, yet emboldened by the knowledge that courage, even small, could alter the course of events. The master, meanwhile, grappled with the unanticipated consequences of his cruelty. His authority, long predicated on fear and absolute obedience, now faced an unpredictable variable. The daughter's resilience, combined with the slave's cautious complicity, created a tension he could not easily resolve. He attempted to maintain his control through intimidation, strategic positioning, and calculated threats, yet each action was met with subtle defiance, eroding the certainty he had relied upon for years. The plantation, once a fortress of absolute hierarchy, now seemed to pulse with uncertainty, the walls themselves a silent witness to the shifting dynamics of power. Throughout the day, the daughter reflected on the night's events, her mind a turbulent mix of fear, shame, and dawning awareness. The humiliation she had endured could never be erased, yet within the trauma lay lessons she could wield, lessons of observation, patience, and the limits of the master's power. The slave, too, grappled with the emotional residue of the ordeal, balancing the guilt of witnessing cruelty with the recognition of a new possibility, that survival could include subtle resistance. That courage could manifest quietly but effectively within the constraints imposed upon them. Together, they began to navigate a new reality, one in which fear coexisted with strategy and trauma coexisted with resilience. The plantation, outwardly unchanged, concealed a silent revolution within its walls. Every object, every creaking floorboard, every shadowed corner carried the memory of the previous night and the unspoken understanding that the established order was no longer unchallenged. The daughter's growing awareness of her own agency, coupled with the slave's cautious support, created an invisible web of resistance that the master could not see, yet which subtly undermined his authority. The balance of power, once absolute, had shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably, setting the stage for future confrontations in which courage and strategy would replace blind obedience and fear. By evening, the weight of the night and day's unfolding aftermath settled heavily over the plantation. The daughter, exhausted but resolute, moved with measured intent, aware of the power she had reclaimed, however fragile. The slave, equally worn yet strengthened by his emerging role, mirrored her careful navigation of the household, aware that survival now required not just obedience, but intelligence, courage, and moral awareness. The master, sensing the subtle erosion of his dominance, moved through the halls with a vigilance born of unease, aware that the seeds of resistance planted during the previous night could grow into consequences he could not control. The first true consequences of the unthinkable acts were not immediate, but psychological, embedded in every glance, every hesitation, every quiet defiance. The daughter's humiliation had forged resilience, and the slave's complicity had transformed into cautious agency. Together, they had begun to rewrite the rules of survival within the plantation, creating a tension-laden environment in which the master's absolute control was no longer guaranteed. The plantation itself, a symbol of wealth and cruelty, became a theater not only of suffering but of subtle resistance, a place in which courage and strategic defiance could exist even under the shadow of oppression. As night fell once more, the grand hall, once a space of absolute authority, now carried a weight of anticipation, of unresolved tension. The daughter, physically weakened but mentally sharpened by her ordeal, moved with a sense of purpose that was newly forged. The slave, attuned to every nuance of her behavior, offered silent support, reinforcing her emerging autonomy with subtle actions that avoided confrontation but maintained solidarity. The master, aware that his control had been challenged, remained vigilant yet increasingly frustrated, a man whose absolute dominance had been quietly undermined by the resilience of those he sought to suppress. In the quiet moments before sleep, both the daughter and the slave reflected on what had transpired and what lay ahead. The emotional scars of the previous night were undeniable, yet within the trauma lay an unexpected empowerment. The daughter had survived, endured, and discovered a spark of agency. The slave had witnessed cruelty and responded with careful solidarity. Together, they had navigated the unthinkable, and though the path ahead remained fraught with danger, they had begun to carve out a space in which courage, intelligence, and defiance could coexist with survival. The plantation, once a symbol of absolute cruelty and unyielding hierarchy, had been irrevocably altered. The walls, silent witnesses to the events, held the echoes of fear, humiliation, and emerging resistance. The daughter, though scarred and battered, had begun to reclaim a fragment of herself, a sense of agency that the master could neither fully anticipate nor entirely suppress. The slave, too, had discovered a new role within the household, one that allowed for cautious support, strategic intervention, and subtle defiance. Together, they represented a quiet rebellion, a fragile yet potent challenge to the absolute control that had once defined the plantation's existence. Even as the plantation settled into an uneasy stillness, the emotional impact of the night lingered. The daughter's humiliation, though endured, had become a crucible for resilience. The slave's witness had evolved into participation through subtlety and intelligence. And the master, confronted with the limits of his authority, had been forced to recognize that fear alone could no longer guarantee obedience. The shadows of the plantation carried a new tension, a delicate balance in which courage, strategy, and the unyielding human spirit had begun to reshape the very fabric of power within those walls.